Speaker.
Call James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to rise on behalf of the Green Party in support of the Business Numbers Bill. I would like to acknowledge the work of the Commerce Committee and the officials in getting the bill to this stage, and in particular to acknowledge the Chair of the Select Committee, Melissa Lee. It's nice to be able to see the passage of this bill at last. It's obviously not the longest bill to wend its way through the House, but it has taken over a year now to get to this stage. One of my questions that I've always held about this is why it requires an Act of Parliament to be able to issue numbers to trading entities and businesses in New Zealand. And it does seem to me quite strange that it actually requires an Act of Parliament for us to pass a law for the government to say, here you are, here's a number. But apparently it does. And so there you have it. We are committed to this course of action. But it does raise a question to me about the extent to which legislation is required to do what seems to be a fairly basic function. I want to acknowledge that there are a number of concerns that have been raised at all stages of the process, which haven't been entirely adequately answered by the government as the bill has wound its way through the process. One of those are the fairly well-worn concerns that previous speakers tonight have spoken on, which is in relation to the ability of the government to actually deliver the business numbers project to the people to whom it's supposed to benefit, and to do so in a manner that's efficient and effective, and what appears to be a lack of resources that are being provided in order to be able to deliver once the legislation is passed. So I think that is a concern that does still need answering. One of the things I think that we need to do is to ensure that having passed this bill and the rollout starts going, that we actually have good methods of monitoring the effectiveness, because often when it comes to these kinds of programs, these kinds of services, often they can end up being of more benefit to the government than they are to the people to whom it's supposed to benefit. And it becomes a tool of government helping, making things more efficient and effective for government, but actually making things, in many cases, more difficult for the communities that they're supposed to serve. So I would like to see I would like to know what kind of monitoring is going to be set up as a result of this, to see whether this program is actually delivering what it's supposed to do. One of the other concerns that was raised at a number of stages was around privacy and data security, and there have been a number of reasonably high-profile cases in recent times where the government has lost data, or data has become exposed. And in order to have a business numbers bill, Mr. Speaker, obviously users of that need to provide a reasonable amount of personal information. And so, again, we would need to know what kind of monitoring and systems are in place to ensure that not only that the system is being delivered effectively, but also that users' data is safe and provided for. Having said that, there are a number of benefits here. They have, been fairly well trotted out in terms of the cost of doing business, of interacting with government services and having to re-register and have different registration processes with different agencies and so on. So that benefit, that set of benefits, is obviously why the Green Party is interested in is supporting this bill, because it will make business interactions with government more efficient, faster, or it is certainly intended to. It does provide the opportunity to harmonise more effectively with Australia, which is obviously very important to us and very important to businesses that trade with Australia. But I just wanted to focus for a minute on some of the opportunities, some of the things that actually haven't been spoken about either in the regulatory impact statement or in the business case that the government put forward when it tabled the bill in the first place. And these are things I think that would be well worth exploring. The first is the opportunity to use this to assist with the government's big data set about trading enterprises and businesses in New Zealand. So having set up a unique identifier number and developed a trading relationship with not just limited liability companies, but trading entities of all sorts across the country, we should be able to get a much better picture than we currently do. I say we should be able to get a much better picture than we already have of the size and nature of New Zealand business and trading organisations. And that in itself will become incredibly valuable in terms of the government's ability to shape services to those different sectors. I say this recently, I just wanted to use the example of that little Wellington-based company Xero that is currently doing the accounts for most of the planet, and their ability from that position to be able to aggregate data to build up a very sophisticated picture about the nature of business and of trade in New Zealand and around the world. They actually have better data than the government does because, of course, they're doing the books for most of these organisations, or a very large number of these organisations. And so I know that the Business Numbers program isn't designed specifically to do that, but it does create the mechanism to enable that kind of big data collection and analysis later on. So I think that's an opportunity that we want to explore here. The second, which I've mentioned before, is the opportunity to try and use this to cut down on fraud and zombie companies, which is a large and growing problem. The idea that people, in many cases, small trades organisations will simply shut down their business rather than pay the bills and then reopen under another name and in order to get out of paying bills, and that they will do this repeatedly. So this is, I get this a lot as I travel around the country, that people in business are constantly frustrated by this phenomena, and that there isn't an easy way of dealing with it. And so one of the opportunities, again not explicitly provided for in the legislation, but one that this may enable, is the opportunity for us to have that one-to-one relationship with these trading enterprises, and to use that to be able to cut down on instances of fraud and zombie companies, operators that are shutting down and then starting up without paying the bills from their previous entity. So that's a second opportunity that I think that we want to explore, having set up this program. And the third opportunity that I think that this does is the ability to create aggregate services. So in New Zealand, if you work for a large company, or large companies will have access to things like deals on cheaper petrol for company cars. They'll have insurance deals, health insurance. They'll be able to get bulk discounts on materials and so on and so forth. And actually, the vast majority of enterprises in New Zealand, which are very small operators, don't have the scale to be able to tap into these kinds of deals. So the companies that are least able, most vulnerable, actually are the ones who end up paying the higher prices, and it's the larger companies who've got the resources who pay the lower prices. And so I think that being able to form this one-to-one relationship with all of these enterprises and trading organisations around the country does provide the opportunity to create aggregate services to very small micro enterprises and so on that otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to them. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think one of the obvious things here is that we already have business numbers in place for most of our companies in New Zealand, or many companies in New Zealand, limited liability companies and so on. And all this really does is to simply extend the same service in many ways to other organisations like social enterprises, state sector organisations like schools and DHBs, non-profits, charity shops and so on, freelancers and sole traders that aren't covered by the other program. And so the idea that actually we'll be able, that everyone, no matter what their sort of trading form, will be able to interact with government in the same way and on an equal footing is a good one. So in conclusion, it is odd that it needs legislation to issue a number. There are some concerns that I don't think were addressed adequately as the bill passed its passage through the House. I do think that the bill does have the promise of many benefits and some unexplored opportunities, and so the Green Party is pleased to be able to support this bill in its final reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.